This program I gave about 10 years ago, and I'm going to identify 3 people in the audience who actually helped me with this. They probably don't even know they did. So, Mike, I have some information about your family in my program.
Oh.
And Bob, I have program information from your program on Absorka Park I'm going to use. And then, Tom, can you wave your hand? Tom Varsali helped me with this 10 years ago. This program started with him asking me to give a program at Earth Day.
Yeah, it was a local food expo. It was in conjunction with downtown farmers market.
So it's about 10 years ago when I did this program. I've given it since about 5 times. I've added slides. This time I had to take some out because it's so long. So strap in, we've got a lot to cover. The county of Sheridan was very, very busy with all kinds of agricultural endeavors over the years. I'm going to just review this. The early inhabitants had the perfect food. There was wild game, there was wild berries, and then of course they ate that for years and years, for about 10,000 years plus. It was the perfect food, and we still have that food here today. What they made was called pemmican, and it was made out of dried meat and dried fruit with a little fat. It gave them a lot of energy and protein. But where my program really starts is in 1867 when the cattle industry began in Sheridan County. This chart I found gives you the value and the number of cattle throughout the years. I added the blizzards and the hard winters. That was about every 10 years there was a blizzard that hit. One of the blizzards that hit in 1949 is not listed on here. It fell off of one of my slides, so sorry, but 49 was a really bad winter. There was snow 20 to 30 feet deep, and they killed off thousands and thousands of cattle that year. There was a great program on Wyoming Public Television that you should listen to. It's the Blizzard of 49. You really do need to hear that and see it. You will learn so much from that documentary. Because they remembered that blizzard. There were also grasshopper infestations about every 20 years that actually took the feed for some of the cattle. And I'll describe a little bit later when the big cattle industry players kind of went by the wayside, and then the smaller ranchers decided to start fencing their own property. This was the first pioneer in what we call northern Wyoming, and this is Opie Hanna. He settled here 1 mile south of Bighorn, and his homestead would be like the first one established in Sheridan County that was like legitimate. A lot of people were here before, but may not have stayed. He stayed and he farmed and he ranched very early. In 1878, he went to Cheyenne and bought his plow and his seed drill. That contraption is still there on his homestead. In 1881, we have Jack and Helen Dow established orchards. They're about a mile to the west of us. And they raised apples, pears, cherries, and plums. I'm going to read from this diary. This is from the Spear family. When General Crook's army camped all along Little Goose Creek, this would be 1876, they left stacks of beer bottles at all of their campsites. The settlers used some of these for canning wild fruit by breaking off the neck. They dipped a string in kerosene, then wound it around the bottleneck and set it on fire. then dipped it in cold water and knocked the neck off of the bottle. And then they would use candle wax or paraffin to seal it. This is Virginia Bell Benton's spear. And in her diaries, there's so much history on local food that I only pulled a few of her diary entries. They took milk from the Weatherwax homestead, and that's where the Gallatin Ranch is, which is south of us a couple of miles. They would then take the milk up to Mrs. Hurlbut, which was at the Hidden Valley Ranch. Now, I always thought that they would have their own milk cows and that they would make their own butter, but they didn't. They took them to Mrs. Weatherwax to make their butter. And this is in 1882. Their neighbor, Mr. Wright, sold them 5 bushels of potatoes. Then they plowed a garden on April 4th. They planted onion seed sets, and then it snowed. One of the things you will find, I want you to listen to potato, wheat, turkeys, market gardens. You will be amazed at how much happened here. The next diary entry was April of 1882. Remember this name, Mr. Lambriger. He came and bought 600 pounds of wheat. Now this is 1882. So they must have had a huge wheat field south of us. We're not sure exactly where, but the Spear Ranch was quite massive at that time. On May 3rd, they plowed and they dropped spuds. They then bought jelly and peaches at the store in Bighorn, at the Bighorn Merc. They were buying their jelly and peaches. They didn't preserve at that time. In June, she found gooseberries and strawberries, and then they gave their cabbage plants to their neighbors. In 1881, I found this map of Sheridan, and downtown Sheridan, I guess I can walk over there. This up here, it says a big garden. This is like a market garden, and this here is a wheat field. This is where the library is in Sheridan, and this is like Main Street. It's 1881. They had acres and acres of wheat. What did they need? They needed a flour mill. So in the mid-80s, there were 2 flour mills that were built. One was at Beckton. It was actually called Milltown at the time. And then at Wolf Creek Canyon. There must have been a lot of wheat for them to build the mills. So the millstones in the upper right, that's from the Beckton Stock Farm. I believe those were the entry posts into the ranch for a long time. Then the lower mill was at the Beckton Mill, and the Townsends purchased this from Beck. And some of you might remember Jim Townsend. He worked for us over at the cemetery. Jim is one of the little kids in the stream there. The Townsends had the mill for many years, and Mr. Townsend also raised prize chickens, and he won numerous state awards for his roosters. This is an ad that we have from the Beckton Mill. They would deliver to Dayton, Sheridan, and Bighorn. They would only deliver to Buffalo if the weather was good. This is another diary from the Spear family. This is the Bentons. And this is Elsa's handwriting that she transcribed from the diaries, by the way. We're now in 1884. They killed 4 geese. They had corn, peas, and potatoes. Pa took a wagon load of potatoes to Buffalo. Then Frank took 2 dozen chickens, 25 pounds of plums to Buffalo. The Darlingtons were selling deer meat. You would think they'd kill their own deer. Then Ma and I picked 500 ears of corn, and Pa took it to Sheridan to sell. So they were raising huge gardens at that time, potatoes and corn. The first fair in Wyoming was here in Bighorn in 1885. It was about not even a mile to the east of us. It was in the flat, if anybody knows where the Loomises lived, with the Berries. That is where the first fair took place on Walt Drive that we're aware of today. There were hundreds of entries. The president of the fair was Henry Coffeen, and the secretary was J.O. Willits. Patty, do you want to wave? She would be J.O. Willits' great-granddaughter. This is a diploma or a certificate of award and of course we were in Johnson County at the time, we weren't Sheridan County yet. This was from the first fair in 1885. This is a diploma given to Mrs. Dan Hillman, and that would be Zane's grandmother. First premium for marigolds, chaparral jelly, and currant jelly. In the newspaper in September of that year, there are pages and pages of the awards. So much information in that newspaper. And I'll just review some of the awards. The Boar Hog first premium went to Harry Fulmer. The second would be to J.O. Willits for Peking ducks. The third, I'm just going to tell you all the poultry different categories. Chickens, turkeys, ducks, pigeons, and eagles. Vegetables grown and awarded were potatoes, pumpkins, squash, onions, cabbage, beets, rutabagas, watermelons, turnips, and celery. In the dairy products, they had 2 columns of awards. One was for fresh butter, the other was for preserved butter. So the Colorado Colony Ditch Company started in about 1885, and what we came across, Eddie Shrunk gave me their accounting booklet, and in there are food expenses. So it's nice to know how much they paid for food. And here were 67 pounds of pork at 10 cents a pound, cost $6.70. 100 pounds of potatoes, $1.50. Elk meat was $8, but the oats for the mules was $15. And I think you can see it's 1,000 pounds of oats. Now Jerome Brown came to Bighorn in about 1885, and he settled here for a while. Then he decided to go to Buffalo to establish his business because he got a contract with Fort McKinney. Mrs. Brown stayed in Minnesota and waited for him to establish the homestead here. Then she loaded up the train and brought their herd of dairy cows. They had chickens. I don't have all of what she brought on the train. But he went up and took 4 wagons to bring everything to Bighorn. What he did in Buffalo was he had a couple of caves where he would process his cheese and let it age. And they raised turkeys, pigs, dairy cows, and chickens. He also had a large market garden. They arrived in Buffalo about the time of the Johnson County Cattle War. All of that business was headed towards Buffalo. He was elected as county commissioner, and then he was on the assassins list. And he served during a very difficult time. It was very tumultuous over there. There's a lot of the rustlers out where they lived east of Buffalo. And their daughter, Edna Brown, she later was married to Ray Wood. She was 14 at the time, and it was her job to go out and get all of the milk cows in every day. She kept going through the rustlers' camps, didn't mean to, but that's where the cows were. And so she was on the assassination list for both the rustlers, because they thought she was a spy, and then the cattlemen thought she was a spy. So she was on 2 lists to be assassinated. And she was only 14, but they thought she was a spy. Edna, we have quite a story on her. She wrote a beautiful story. And when she was working for her dad, she had to milk 12 cows before she went to school, and that's when she was 14. After the Johnson County Cattle War, the Browns came here, and they moved about 2 miles west of us on Jackson Creek, and so he's continued to sell cheese and have eggs and his market garden. Someone who was very influential in northern Wyoming history is Henry Coffeen. He came in the mid-80s. He was one to establish Sheridan County. This is the petition to establish Sheridan County. And he was one of the very first in the area to have an irrigation ditch. And he cut the ditch through the property over by Banner. He was also the one to help us set up Mount Hope Cemetery with J.O. Willits. Okay, the name Lamberger again shows up in the Cold Spring Seed Farm, and they were west of Bighorn on Jackson Creek as well. This was a little tiny catalog. I found this in the bottom of Sally Springer's filing cabinets. It was, don't ask me why, I just happened to pull the drawer out of these 13 file cabinets. This is the thing that was sitting down on the floor. It could have just been lost forever. But this is the catalog. There's 60 pages. What they sold were the seeds and the saplings. This was 1889. And in the catalog, I'm just going to read a few things that they sold. Turnips, herbs, grains, and tobacco. Tobacco was a big plant here that they did raise their own tobacco. And then they originated Wyoming Chief seed corn, and the ears would be 8 to 10 inches long, and that was from the Lamberger farm. This is the ice cutters. The early pioneers couldn't have had the food that they did without their ice, and every winter they would go south of us to Woods' Pond. We always called it Woods' Pond, but out at the Spear Ranch, where they would cut the ice. And you notice the women are wearing dresses. And J.O. Willits is in this photo. I'm not sure which one he is. But every block in Bighorn had a small ice house. It was a small, centrally located ice house where the neighbors could use whatever ice they wanted. And when I was growing up, there was one of those left in town, and it was always called the block house. And I didn't know if it was for the block, if it where people lived, or it was for the block of ice. This is a threshing machine. This is a piece of artwork that George Ostrom did. This was about their homestead out east of Sheridan. And I've never seen this before, how the actual threshing machine worked. And normally you just see the stack and the men working. But this was George Ostrom's homestead. This is a harvest scene south of the girls' school, up on the home ranch. Now, I know this isn't food, but my goodness. Sheridan Export Beer was a huge industry in Sheridan for many, many, many years, probably 50 years. And they were at one time the largest employer in the state of Wyoming. In the 1880s, they were able to produce 3,000 barrels of beer a year. And it just went up from there. So they bottled beer until Prohibition. After the Prohibition hit, they switched their operation to bottle soft drinks. They sold candy. They also sold tobacco. They resumed brewing beer in 1933. At one point, they could produce 60,000 barrels annually. They changed over to cantaloupe. They were like the first in the nation to introduce flat top pop cans. This is Denio Milling Company. This is located on Broadway. Just north or to the left would be Sheridan Commercial Company. And later on, that building burned. Now here's Lamberger again. He won at the Chicago World's Fair, first premium for wheat. And it was 40 bushels per acre. And it was George Beck who decided to send a bag of his wheat into the World's Fair, but they never heard back what had happened. So I'm going to read from George Beck's story. That young fellow, Lamberger, was mighty surprised in the fall, not only to receive first place in competition with the entire world, but also a delegation of salesmen from seed houses all over the country, beating a path to his door to buy seed from him. Well, what did he do with that seed? They offered $1 a pound for his crop. And it was the best Russian wheat that these salesmen had seen. And what had happened was he had never heard back, and he fed most of it to his chickens and pigs, and then the rest he ground into flour. He then declared bankruptcy. But that happened in Bighorn, the best wheat at the World's Fair. In 1894, we have the Sheridan Meat Company. I believe they started maybe out in Acme area. And they were here for over a century. And the Sheridan Meat Company, you'll hear me talk about them again. Now, Charles Bard was one of our early pioneer families. He owned an establishment just north of us, just on the other side of Christy Love's house. And he ran eating establishments in Buffalo, actually during the Johnson County Cattle War, and in Bighorn, and then later in Sheridan. In this container, he could have his flour, and then the little drawers along the side, it says soda, nutmeg, cinnamon, spice, and pepper. He then also sold flour and spices. When he owned the Western Hotel in Sheridan, he would take payment by using all various things he would take for payment: potatoes, fruit trees, flour, and you'll see also he took cash. But for the most part, he would take food in payment for their room rent. Now, the strawberry patches were numerous throughout the county. These were commercial strawberry patches. This one is about where Sheridan College stands. There was one at the Gallatin Ranch south of us. There was one at Opie Hanna's homestead, run by a Japanese gentleman, but it had to close down during World War II because he was reinterred over at Hart Mountain. He never came back. No one knew of him after the war. Then we had another one at Absarka Park, which is out the opening of Big Goose. And there's another one that was started east of Sheridan, out towards Ucross. So now we're about at the turn of the century. Major local food was wheat, meat producers, strawberry fields, milk, and dairy produce. Now, the dairies were starting to get numerous. And about that time, I think we had 5 dairies in the county. In 1900, we had the town of Dietz started. There were other mills that opened up. the Weltner Mill near the where the library is, Dutch Creek over at Wyarno, the Kearney Mill, and then there was a market garden over on Prairie Dog. And this was a commercial market in town, and they sold corn per hundredweight. So that was another produce that was becoming popular, was corn. And this is a picture of the market garden on Prairie Dog Creek. This is about where the tank farm is now. So we went from having a market garden to a tank farm. This is a wheat field that's close to Bighorn. I'm not really sure where this is placed. Almost like maybe it was south of Bighorn. And along with these large wheat fields, we had potatoes. And the Quarter Circle Bell Ranch near Dayton, where the Padlock Ranch is, that whole flat, was owned by Uncle Billy Robinson. He had 18 acres of potatoes. He supplied the Pullman dining cars for Burlington Railroad all the way from Billings to Chicago. They loaded in Manchester, and that industry went on for years. The potato farm by Dayton. This is another garden that was out at Bradford Britton, and some of this was probably a market garden, but that's how big the garden was to produce food for the workers on the Moncrief Ranch. Okay, the dairy in the whole county was south of us. It was southeast on Little Goose, which I'm thinking it was out at the Gallatins, in that area near the Bradford Britton. And this would be 1907 in the city directory. At that time, there were 6 dairies in town and 1 creamery. This is the town of Monarch in 1908. I mention this because every house in Monarch had their own garden. They had their own cannery. They would share they had a cannery machine. I can't remember, Tom, how that was. They shared this cannon making machine that they could produce and can their own canned goods in the community. And they would just share it with all their neighbors. And then in Monarch, they also had a small store, but people were so self-sufficient that there weren't too many stores that were operating there. Ice became a huge industry. And in Sheridan, this would be Southwest Sheridan. Let's see, Helen, is that?
NB.
NB Avenue? NB Avenue, okay. That would be Big Goose Creek is where the ice was taken. And Helen lives down near there, and you found where they had their ice house at one time,
Yeah.
right?
And before the flooding, you could find where the dam was, where they had dammed the creek and backed it up and made ice off of the creek.
Okay, it was a major industry for many years. And they hauled the ice around in a cart drawn by horses. And Jack Webb, his dad was a big, I don't know if he invested in that company or he just worked for them for many years, but Jack Webb has lots of photos of that. And I don't have a photo of Jack Webb and his family with the ice house. Now here is the Absarka Park Orchards. This was from Bob's book. And Bob took us out to Absarka Park, and we ate apples from those trees. They were the biggest apples I've ever seen in Sheridan County. They were huge and delicious. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of this article that they had 40 acres of apple orchards. And I just put this in here because Louis, I know, he would buy all of his supplies from the local farmers. And, you know, his onions, his lettuce, tomatoes, and then I believe he made his own pickles. Now, in order for all of this to go on down here, For all of the farms, the orchards, and the gardens, the wheat fields, we needed water. So several reservoirs were built. And this is Park Reservoir. And I'll show you a picture of E.C. Bowman, who built this. His partner was Mr. Lovell. And Lovell came here to help on this, and then went over the mountain, and of course the town of Lovell is named after him. But he was here in Bighorn for a few years, and Bowman and Lovell built at least 2 reservoirs that I'm aware of, possibly 3. And we also have pictures of all of the building of this reservoir. And then when they had to repair it, we also have those photos from the Bowman collection. More on the Zorga Park, they would have Sunday dinners, and they would actually have wagons come and pick up people in Sheridan and take them out for the day to eat their chicken dinners, and there would be 100 guests served on Sundays. It says that the manager had 400 chickens. He was going to increase that to 1,000. They were growing their own strawberries, currants, all of the fruits, the apples in their apple pie, and they had fresh cream. I think 115 quarts a week. And then of course their vegetable garden. So it was all growing right there at Zorga Park, and it was probably a delicious meal. That went on for years at Zorga Park. Okay. Now we have the blizzard of 1911, 1912. This is when the large cattlemen started to die out. They lost so many cattle that year, and they had taken smaller ranchers and taken all of the cows out to the eastern part of the county, and so many died off that then the ranchers here locally decided they were going to keep their cows to themselves, and they started fencing. So the big cattlemen, basically this is sort of the dying off of the larger herds. In 1913, this was George Olstrom's mother, Marguerite, and she was known as the watermelon woman lady. She grew acres and acres of watermelon. That's how she survived and sold her watermelon. And this was out at Spring Willow, which is further than Wayarno. So she would have to, bring the wagon into Sheridan to sell her watermelon. This is the fire at the Sheridan Flour Mill that was over on Broadway, and that's the Sheridan Commercial, the building to the left. Then Denio decided to rebuild the mill, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The Sheridan Sugar Beet Factory was built in 1915, and I'll read to you a little bit about what is in that building. 450 carloads of machinery and material, 100 tons of structural steel, 32,000 sacks of cement, 500,000 board feet of lumber, 6,000 cubic feet of sand and gravel. This one I just cannot imagine. 1.5 miles of concrete flume inside the building. They produced 44,000 tons of sugar beet their first year. The sugar content was 13%. And at that time, there was 3,000 acres of sugar beets in Sheridan County. Out east of town, there was the very first homemakers club was established at Ucross, I think. And that was established in Sheridan County in 1915. That's the first in the United States that the homemakers established here. And that's the completion of the sugar factory. They operated for about 30 years, and they produced pulp as a byproduct, and they would provide the pulp to the ranchers, and it was free feed for the cows and sheep. The experimental farm was established in 1916. The land was given by Governor Kendrick, which was east of Sheridan. And I don't know, is the experimental farm still operating? It's still operating?
Still running.
1917, George Zagorski became a butcher in Acme, and what they would do is every week they would take orders, and then they would stay up at night and do the butchering. He could kill 2 beef and maybe 10 hogs in a week. It was a good living for a family of 8, and in the summertime that's when they butchered at night. They took the meat around to the miners the next day and then took orders for the following day. Most of the meat was always boiled. Maybe because it was tough, I'm not sure. And there's George Zagorski. Now this is E.C. Bowman. He's the one who built Bowman Reservoir and also Park Reservoir. He was the first president of the Farm Bureau. He lived here in Bighorn, I'm going to say just 2 blocks north of here. He also was part owner of the Box Cross Ranch, and I don't know if people understand how they did that. They kept their working crew all the time year round, and in the wintertime they worked them on the Box Cross Ranch, taking care of the cattle. They also had hogs, and in the summertime then the crew would go to the mountains and help with the reservoir, and they would take the hogs up there and just let them loose. And they'd go butcher a hog every now and again. And Mrs. Bowman would be the main cook and take care of all the men at the mountains, and then she would be down here and also have to cook for all the men here. The crew was, I think, about 13 to 15 men year round that she had to cook for every day. They also built a large orchard on the ranch. We have 2 areas where we have apples. I don't have a picture of the tree, but a couple of years ago the University of Wyoming came and did DNA testing on our orchard. And we have 1 tree that they don't know what kind it is. There's not another tree in the state of Wyoming that is like this tree. I don't know how many trees they've done, maybe 500 to 600. And we have 1 apple tree in our yard that's the largest circumference of any apple tree in the state of Wyoming. And it's a lovely tree. It produces huge apples, not as big as the ones at Zorga Park. It's the only apple that my granddaughter will eat. When she went through chemo, it changed her taste buds, and it's the only applesauce she will eat. So she always asks, is it homemade applesauce? And I'll say yes, and she'll just eat it right up. I don't know the kind of apple. I believe it's a Jonathan. But we have approximately 9 different kinds of apples on the ranch. And the only other place around that has similar trees is the Canyon Ranch. Now, this is a relative of Patty's. This is Victor's aunt. This is Sarah Garber. Is it Rapp or Rob? Do you know? Rob. She came to help during World War I, and you'll notice she's wearing a dress. This was one of these reports that Tom shared through the extension agent, and this is for 100 families. It's 1921. They had a savings of $10,000. It's quarts of food, fruit, vegetables, poultry, beef, pork. Let's see, what was the thing that was interesting to me on this one? Pickled pork. 2,000 pounds of pickled pork. And 3,000 pounds of sausages made. 12,000 and a half pork that was smoked. That's a lot of meat. This is the sanitary. Sheridan Creamery now is located in Sheridan. I'm not exactly sure of the address on the Sheridan Creamery Company, but again, the dairies were increasing in number. I don't know, maybe 20 at this time across the county. And we have here Clean Burn. This is the area Okay, the interstate now comes off this hill and comes this way and goes towards Billings. Acme is over here. So Cleanburn, this is the area that's flat, that had all these mining camps in it. And I don't know how many people lived there. How many houses do you think were there? 100, don't know. But in this photograph, you will see chicken hutches, we have rabbit hutches, there's a large garden, and so again, they were very self-sufficient. And I don't know, could have been Tom who told me this. I can't remember who told me this. They would have one carload of grapes come in from California, and then they'd have a stomping party, and they'd make their wine. And
That's correct. That was the Rodolinis. The Rodolinis brought in their grapes. They bring it in from California.
they'd have a stomping party. Hey, this is Mike's family. This is from Cazaraville. This accounting book is huge, big. This is the mining camp just south of Acme. That it's called Cazaraville, right, Mike?
Yep.
Is George your grandfather, great-grandfather?
My grandfather George had a saloon and a store there.
Okay, this was from the store.
Okay, it's from the store.
And the miner's name is John Cryana, Kryana. Now what he bought was not necessarily for his family. 25 pounds of sugar, 25 pounds of raisins, 2 pounds of yeast, and corks. What do you think he was making? And it's week after week after week. A lot of booze. This is 1923, and this is the Denio Milling Company. They later became the largest in the state, one of the largest employers in the state. It's now located in this photo on Coffeen Avenue. And of course, it's the flouring mill that we still see today. And it was, the concrete grain elevators are 144 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter. 240,000 bushels of wheat could be stored there. And they would run 24 hours a day. The gentleman, I believe, on the right, and he has that hand truck. These hand trucks could load 500 pounds. His name is Raybach, and he has one of the hand carts.
And there was another flour mill. It was at the corner of, at the bottom of High School Hill on Dow Street.
That was Weltner's.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. At one time, there were 7 in Sheridan County. We had 7 mills in Sheridan County. And this now took over all of the work from the other mills. So the other ones were starting to close down. So here you see the sugar factory and also the flour mill. The reason that this is really interesting is a lot of people don't know that the train came all the way down on the west side and would stop here on Brundage. That's how they loaded their wheat. And then they also unloaded the flour to get it transported. Now also along that rail line would be the brick factory before it got to Washington Park.
There was another flouring mill at Crow. And that's the sign out there, you can't read. It's Bashuhashi, which is the bread place. So there was a flour mill at Crow Agency also.
In 1924, Jersey Creamery was established, and this is on Main Street, right where Mark Murphy's law office is. I'll have another better photo in a minute. In the 20s, they decided to grow beans, commercially in Sheridan County. It lasted about 5 years, and Victor reported to me that the problem they had with our soil is that we had little tiny white rocks in our soil. And it was really hard to figure out if they were beans. And the little stones started to damage the machinery. And so it lasted only about 5 years here. The bean companies went over to the basin. I think they're still canning beans over in Lovell.
Yeah, they are.
I
So,
went there one time and played for the bean ball. They have a big ball, not a round ball, dancing. That's their bean ball. I thought it was a game. Had no idea.
so this is the sheep operating, the sheep feeding operation at the sugar beet factory. You could bring your sheep in there, they'd have free feed, the mush. Let's see if I have that story in here at this point. In 1925, they profited $9,000 across the county with their turkeys. They had 25,000 pounds of turkeys loaded on the train car at that time. And with the sugar beet mush, I don't know if you've been around sugar beets, but they're really odoriferous. They smell horribly. And when Victor would go and get the mush, he wouldn't be allowed to go in the store. So they would tell Victor that, stay outside, we'll go get your mail. So he would truck the mush or mash up to his sheep farm. And this is probably a picture of Tom's. Tom said that the cabbage and the potatoes really saved the families during the Depression with their sauerkraut and their potato cellars. And here's 1929. The receipts are now up to $17,000. And honey was a huge producer throughout the county, and it still is to this day. Big industry. The bees that are on our ranch probably happens to you too. All of the bee producers now go together and hire a semi-truck to take the hives to California for the almond season. And so they organize all the beekeepers to do that. So once a year, they truck them to California and then they come back. The bees never have a vacation. They're working here in the summer and they're working in California in the winter. 1931, the receipts are now up to like 21,000. This is at the experimental farm. This is George's Meat Market. And in this picture, there are 13 butchers. Anybody as a young child that went into that store, my dad would take us in quite often, and you'd always get a hot dog. A free hot dog. Anybody remember that? Okay. Now, the byproduct they made money on was lard. How many lard companies were there in Sheridan? 6.
Wow.
6 different lard companies. 1934, there were 15 carloads of turkeys being shipped at a value of $70,000. There were 13 grain elevators between Hardin and Gillette. Is it in this one I want to tell you about? Okay. In 1935, the drought government program, they were doing a buyback program, and I can't remember how much it was per pelt, but it was like 25 cents a pelt for sheep, maybe $1 for the cows, I don't remember. But they had to kill, the ranchers had to kill their sheep and their cattle, put them in the gullies, and they bring the pelts in and they get paid. However, it was making such a stink and bringing in so many critters out in the gullies in the eastern part of the county that they decided to start a canning company here and can the meat and give the canned meat to the people starving in Sheridan. So Sheridan Meat started operating 24 hours a day. They handled 6,000 head of cattle in one winter, and the cannery was on West Brundage Street. It's across from where Captain Clean is. They had that operating to give free food to the people of Sheridan. So again, turkeys. It was a huge industry. And I'm going to read a couple of things from an interview that I did with John Generu. When he was in high school, now we're talking probably in the 40s, he said the high school kids were let out of school across the county. And they would go to the different farms and they would butcher. So the boys would butcher the turkeys. They would take a sharp object like an ice pick and jam it behind the eyes into the brain. That would kill the turkeys instantly. But what happened also, all the feathers fell off. So then they would turn them upside down, chop the head, let the blood drain, and all they had to do is pick off a few of the feathers. It was fast and it was clean. After they dressed them, they let them be there for like 24 hours. Then the girls would come back and do the dressing on the turkeys, and open them up and take the giblets out and process them in gunny sacks, wrap them up, and then they would take them into the ice company, and the ice company would be putting ice on the train loads, like 15 train car loads. They'd start up in Dayton, Manchester, slowly come through the county, go through Sheridan, go over to Claremont. That also would bring in the people from Buffalo. So that's how they would take care of the turkeys. And the turkeys would go back east for Thanksgiving and Christmas. One of the interesting stories, and I don't know who I got this from, I think it was from Victor. But he said the young kids now, they had a job too. So at recess time, during any of the grasshopper infestations, the grasshoppers would be so large they would choke the turkeys. So the school kids would go out and poke the grasshoppers down the gullet. So they wouldn't choke, and then there was food in the turkey tummy. So that's what the school kids did throughout the day, was saving the turkeys. So there you have it, free food. Now here we have Mrs. Davis's ranch. You can see that she must have had a large operation because she has storage for the feed. Now turkeys started in the 20s, and I know that the Lovelaces had turkeys over by the cemetery. My brother Jim worked there, and that would have been in the early 60s. So there were turkeys into the 60s. So that's a recap of how much money Sheridan made during the Depression. George Ostrom worked for the federal government. He was a wolfer at first, and then he became an entomologist. And this is his crew. And they poisoned the grasshoppers. They sprayed 30,000 acres of land. And the crop value saved was $250,000.
My dad's in that picture.
Your dad's in that picture. Who is it, Bob?
Don Ralston.
Which one?
I don't know. I can't see from here, but he was on George's crew.
He was on George's crew.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it. We'll see if we can identify him. Later on, they used airplanes. Victor told me this story that during this time, in any of the irrigation ditches, they would pour fuel oil, and then when these infestations came, the grasshoppers and the crickets would get in the oil and they couldn't get out. and then they'd come and burn the ditches. And then they just start over again the next day. So that's how they got rid of a lot of the grasshoppers. Also,
I
Victor,
helped put up sheet metal, tore off sheet metal roofing and made fences to channel the crickets into those fire pits when I was a little guy.
Victor was a young man, and he and Orr had to go out wherever they had land in the eastern part of the county. And he said, no matter where you went, you always had to have chains because you couldn't go up a hill without, going over the grasshoppers. So it'd be really slick to get up the hill because you were just churning through the insects. So here's Sweet, still, 1938. This is Sheridan Heights Ranch. This would be the ranch that is west of the hospital. Now we're having closures starting to come. The Beckton Flour Mill closed down. This is when they took it apart. Sheridan County now had 29 licensed retail dairies. And John Jenner also told me how they would do it here is every dairy would have a vehicle that would go around and they would take turns picking up everybody else's milk. It was quite a community affair. And out here, I think we had 7 dairies, so each one of them took a day to haul everybody else's milk in.
At one time, there were 54 dairies in Sheridan County.
I found it was 69.
That did, okay.
Yeah, when they finally,
I went through Pete Jensen's records and he was county agent, that's where
yeah.
probably some came after that.
Yeah, I heard 50 and then I just recently found 69. I'll see what date it was on that.
One of the jobs of the Teepee Lodge laundry truck was to come down Red Grade and pick up the milk cans at Sewicky's dairy and take it into Sheridan.
So this is the Jersey Creamery on Main Street. It was there for 20 years. And that's where Mark Murphy's law office. This is an Archie Nash photo. This is the Sheridan Livestock Commission. It was in operation for about 30 years. They had sales every Tuesday. This is the potato industry that really took off during World War II. And this, I believe, is at the Schreibeis farm. They raised 40 acres of potatoes during the war. They had to have the older men, 65 or older women and boys were digging potatoes. This is all over the county where they had potato farms.
Got 2 cents a sack for picking potatoes.
What was that?
You got 2 cents a sack for picking potatoes.
The other places that the potatoes were raised, Schreibeis, the PK Ranch, Robinson's in Dayton, and then the Garbers up here in Bighorn, and the Beach Brothers. Oh, sorry. Now during the war, we were short of labor. This is the German prisoners of war in Claremont. Mr. Fowler is the man on the right. He's the only American in this photo. The rest are German prisoners. They were brought here to help with the sugar beet industry. What they did was they hoed the beets, and then of course they dug them out to take them in. They were here for 2 years, 3 years. I can't remember how long they were here, and they loved it here because they had fresh, hot bread every day. And what was Mrs. Fowler's name? Rose Fowler. She was his wife, and she cooked for all these men every day. And many of these prisoners didn't want to go back to Germany. They wanted to stay here. 250 war prisoners were used, and at the time, many Mexican nationals were brought in and were put to work here. And I believe there was one on the Garber Ranch for several years who lived here. There were also many community gardens that were raised during the war. This is called the Victory Garden, and anybody who wanted to come and pick could. These were free producing gardens. This is out east of Sheridan. In 1946, this is the Schreibeis beet truck, and maybe this was a picture of the last beet truck coming in from the Schreibeis ranch. The sugar factory stopped in 47. However, sugar beets continued to be grown here into the 60s. And how I know that is because my brother also worked up at Fordyce's hoeing beets. They would haul them up to Hardin, and that's where they were processed after that. And I just thought this was an interesting photo. The lady helping pick potatoes is in a dress again.
Wow.
So this is the last of the sugar beet campaign. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Victor's story. The Garbers had grown potatoes, and whatever surplus they had, they would take it in by the railroad tracks. There was a huge pile of potatoes. It could have been a community pile. They were always dusted with purple powder, meaning not for human consumption, but they could be for the livestock. So cows cannot eat raw potatoes, but they can if they're cooked. So Victor built a pressure cooker on a trailer, and it would leave the ranch in the morning and slowly go down to Sheridan. They loaded up with potatoes. By the time he got back up home, the potatoes were cooked and he could feed the cows. And I do not know if it still exists. Does it still exist,
I'm
Patty?
not aware of that one. Well, I'll ask. Paul will know.
Paul would know. Yeah, they might have, cut it up and used it for metal somewhere, but his potato pressure cooker story is really precious. We probably have it on an interview. And then, of course, the sugar beet mash. So Victor had free food for his cows and his sheep with both potatoes and with the sugar beet mash. In 1948, Jersey Creamery decided to move, and they're now on the other side of the block. This is on West Works and Brooks, right where the Sheridan County Courthouse parking lot is. It was there for about 30 more years. You could go in and have milkshakes, ice cream, boil your milk right here. This is the retail part. And then, of course, Jersey Creamery was a huge industry in Sheridan for many years, probably one of the largest employers in the county. 1949, we have Pete Jensen. Here is the second man from the right. He would be the county extension agent. Most of us remember him. And of course, George Ostrom is the man on the right. And they would spray across the county now to help with the grasshopper poisoning. In 1950, this was right after the blizzard of 49, there was a lot of die-offs of the cattle herds. And then the dairy industry sort of changed. They started to have refrigerated bulk mail tanks. And so the smaller dairies were not necessarily dying off, but they didn't have refrigeration. Now these four diagrams are pretty interesting. Just take a look at what's going on in Sheridan County. That one's for the cattle, sheep. This is the hogs and horses. So Sheridan was always a big producer during that time. This is 1950. The Best Out West flour mill, then they were producing 2,000 sacks of flour per day. It was wheat, biscuit dough, donut flour, pancake flour. They also had 100 tons of livestock feed a day. Their storage capacity was 420,000 bushels there, and then 200,000 bushels in the rural sites. 1 million bushels were required to keep them operating per year. And this is a picture of the Garber potato farm. And they would sell 100-pound sacks to the schools. Once they took their commercial potatoes out, then they would open it up to the community. And I remember going with my mom and we would dig potatoes. Then we had a potato chip factory. And this opened on West Louth. They later opened up a bigger place. I think it was over on Leopard Street. They employed many girls in high school to do this. They had a hand slicer, they peeled them by hand. And the hand slicer, they put them in a water bath to remove the starch, and then they would put them in the vat of oil. When they were done, it would be drained into a steel table, hand salted. Pardon?
The original owner of the potato chip factory was Beverly Waddell White,
I didn't know that.
my aunt.
She was your aunt.
Yes.
Well, how many girls did she employ? Do you know? At one time?
I do not know. One of the other things I know about my aunt is she had a pecan orchard in New Mexico and she built her own adobe house.
Well, I remember growing up, we never had potato chips in a bag. We always had it in a 5-gallon bucket. And, you know, it was actual painted with all the logo on it, and it was a can of potato chips. And my dad would take it to town and load it back up again and bring it home. That's what we ate our potato chips out of, was a can, not a bag. And I know that she had a hard time finding potatoes here once the potato industry dropped off. She had to order the potatoes into Sheridan County.
Yep.
So that's what brought her industry to a close. Seems like she was in operation maybe 20 years.
It was still there in 1970.
Was it 70? Yeah, about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when they started doing the milking machines. This Lloyd Schreibeis. And this is, well, let's see.
That's
This is Clear
Mitchell,
Creek egg.
J.R. Mitchell,
This is Jared Mitchell, wasn't it, Junior and Helen?
yeah.
Mhm.
no.
Okay, I was thinking Betty was gonna be here today. So the Clear Creek Egg Company, they had 10,000 caged laying hens. And I know here we had Hoffman eggs near Bighorn. And when this was in operation, I think it says here, J.R. Mitchell, it says here the date that they were candled. You know more on that. What does candling mean?
They just light them up from the back and you could see if it had a blood spot in it or any abnormality. That's it.
It was like the quality control.
Yeah.
And J.R.
And
was
cracks
the one
also in the
who
shell.
would do that every single day, you know, looking at the eggs through the candle to be sure that they were good to sell. Then later on, we had hydroponic tomatoes being grown over in Story, and that was in the 60s and 70s, and they sold their tomatoes to Warehouse Market. And then, this is what I remember when I was growing up. These are the different products that we had in the Curry household. And one of the things I didn't talk about was Joe Marshall's cornfield. He would allow the community to go in and pick corn, which we did every year. Also, the Slacks would open their cornfield up to the community to go pick. And so that's what we had here in Sheridan County. And we don't have that anymore. So now we're going to go through the closures. The Ligurskis closed in about the 90s, I believe. Was it the 90s? 1990s? About 1970, Spud Snack Potato Chip Factory closed down. 1972, the Sheridan Flour Mill. Jersey Creamery shut down in 75. Clear Creek Eggs closed down in 79. Sheridan Livestock Commission, the sale barn, closed in 1980. Then Ligursky Meats closed down in 1980, but they're back in business again, probably not at the production that they were. So, the big producers in Sheridan agriculture: wheat, milk, potatoes, eggs, turkeys, strawberries, beans, sugar beets, and apples. And this is sort of a bar graph of what we had here and how long they were in operation. And I know we have, breweries back, but I doubt they're doing 60,000 barrels a year. I don't know what the milk company is doing now, but I'm sure it's not at the volume that Jersey Creamery was. So that's what we have. Any questions or any additions?
There's not a dairy in Sheridan County anymore, is there?
Yeah.
You're probably right, just small producers.
Yeah.
At one time, I was going to tell you, the year of the 69 dairies that we had would have been in late 60, right before Jersey Creamery closed. They had 69 milk producers and cream producers that used Jersey Creamery.
Now we have Walmart, Albertsons, and
And if there's a blizzard down there by Cheyenne, you're not going to get any food. Yeah.
Well,
There is a store on Main Street. Yeah, they're by the Western Hotel.
Yes.
That's, Carlos Buff was president of the American Dairy Improvement Association, when he had his brown Swiss herd up here at Gallatin Ranch. That was 1954.
Yeah, just around Bighorn, there must have been 5 dairies that I'm thinking of that probably had 100 cows or more. Yeah, we were a big producer out here.
hey Judy,
Yeah, Mike.
I know where one marijuana farm was. It was, do you know where the Thunder Child facility is out on the Decker Highway? Tongue River makes a big, wide, long bend back there. And back in those cottonwood trees, there was a marijuana plantation. And the law, I was up there the day the law enforcement was down there checking this out. They couldn't figure out how these people were servicing that. They floated down Tongue River in a boat and took care of their farm, and then floated on down, was picked up at the bridge, so there were never any tire tracks.
Okay. Well, I went longer. Sorry. I shortened it by about 50 slides. So. Yes.
Thank you.
I was always fascinated with the turkeys. You think of this as cattle country, but there for a while there were so many turkey farms, and we literally furnished all the turkeys to the east on Thanksgiving and Christmas. And if the weather was really warm, they didn't get the turkeys on Thanksgiving because they had to ship them and they didn't have ice at that time.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah, I guess the ice didn't come until a little bit later, like in the 40s or 50s. Yeah, they just assumed that they were going to be frozen in the cars when they left here.
Wow.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you. I don't know what to do first.
That was the biggest thing.